And today we're going to try and really simplify genetics for you.
Hmm.
We're going to try and narrow it down to, we may go a little off track, and that's okay, but we're going to try and narrow it down to five crucial genetic insights you need to understand about your health in your own personal health journey. So, with that, welcome, Elwin. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Sandy. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell me your story, because I kind of gave a little bit of a briefing here, but why such an interest in genetics?
It's funny. I always assumed I had bad genes. Maybe some of your listeners can relate to that because both my parents were very unhealthy. We were just talking about it before we started recording. My mother, I think she first had a tumor before I was even born. She had cancer, I'm pretty sure it's 4 times throughout her life. She ended up dying of it when she was 55.
Oh, that's young.
Yeah, when I was 25, and um, and she had tumors several more times. And my dad was also struggled. He had ME at one point and chronic fatigue. He also had a goiter at one point. And so they both had health challenges, and they were both into alternative health. So my dad was really into. He was a biochemist. He was a science teacher, and he had like an organic food stall back in the early 1980s when no one was really doing that, pretty much. Certainly not in England anyway, probably in
Yeah.
California and places they were. So it was quite early in that. And my mother, so she would get, these diagnoses, and sometimes she would also have medical treatment, but she would get into all this alternative treatment. So she would do detoxes, she would have all these healthy foods. I remember all of these, weird looking supplements and weird looking foods everywhere throughout the kitchen. And she would listen to these hypnotherapy tapes for like hours a day with like positive affirmations and stuff like that. And she would have, eventually get better, as I said, with or without also medical treatment as well. But I think in the case of the tumors, often without medical treatment, they would just go away as a result of all this alternative stuff. And then once she got better, she would kind of drop all that, go back to eating junk food, go back to kind of complaining about everything, not having a positive mental attitude, and eventually it would come back again. So I very much saw a correlation, I would say, in my early life between all of these healthy endeavors and health, and conversely, all the unhealthy lifestyle choices and ill health. But anyway, as both my parents are so into that, of course I rebelled against it. I was not interested in it at all. And throughout my teens and 20s, I was, taking drugs and just eating junk food and generally misbehaving a lot. By my late 20s, I was feeling pretty bad. I wasn't diagnosed at that time with chronic fatigue, but everyone, because my dad already had it, and he was like, "You have all the signs of it." And I was kind of signed off work by the doctor. They didn't know what was wrong with me. And I mean, long story short, because otherwise this would be a very long story. I did a bunch of stuff, a bunch of different interventions, probably common health stuff that most of, or maybe all the listeners will have, be familiar with. I cleaned up my diet. I stopped taking drugs. I stopped drinking alcohol. Started exercising. All of that kind of very normal stuff, and started doing some cleanses and detoxes and stuff like that as well. And after, a couple of years, I was starting to feel really better. And I was working as a chef at the time. And before I got really exhausted, I worked at a very busy restaurant where it's just constant adrenaline. And then when I couldn't work anymore, when I started working again, I worked at a retirement home where the pace was the opposite. It was like extremely slow paced. I basically had to prepare 2 meals a day in an 8-hour shift. There's just a lot of sitting around. But it meant I had a lot of time to be learning about health. So I'd spend, maybe 6 hours a day listening to health, education, and maybe a couple of hours reading. And anyway, eventually I started working as chef in a health food restaurant. I started to get, excited about really helping people. And people kept coming up to me and like asking me for health advice because I was doing so much better than I used to. And got a bit of a reputation. Eventually I said, look, I've got to go back to the kitchen. There's cooking to be done. But they were like, um, I said, look, do you want to just sit down for half an hour? You can pay me for a consult and we'll just go through some stuff. And I worked with men to begin with, like guys who wanted to put on muscle and, stuff like that, like very basic stuff. But, got good results and ended up, long story short, I ended up building a health business. I started selling herbs, supplements. I published a book. I did a bunch of different online courses. And for a good almost 10 years, I would say I was doing well, at least by any standard that I could think of. Because first of all, I didn't need any drugs. It used to be I had to wake up and have coffee to function, and cigarettes, and I had to have cannabis and alcohol to calm down in the evening, all that kind of stuff. So after I kicked all that stuff, like I thought I was doing great. I had this healthy lifestyle. I was not eating any processed food. I was not using any drugs. I was able to start businesses and travel the world, whereas before I was working a minimum wage job, massively in debt, barely able to, function. So I thought I was doing great. However, I still had some digestive issues. There were still certain foods that I couldn't eat without having reactions to them. I was quite underweight. I'm 6'3", and I never got more than 150, 155 pounds, something like that. So not seriously underweight, but a bit. And around the age of 39, so that's 4 or 5 years ago now, 4 years ago, um, I started to get this pain, Sandy, and it was around the right rib cage area. And, when someone starts to get stabbing pain there, the first thing you think of is probably liver, right?
Mhm.
Or, maybe rib cage. So I went to a medical doctor, the usual kind of national medicine that we have over here in England. Then I went to a private doctor. They couldn't find anything wrong. They did, MRI, CT, blood tests, blah, blah, blah. Nothing in the liver. Okay. Nothing around there. Okay. So then I thought, well, it was affecting my digestive system because every time I'd eat, this pain would get worse. But I thought, well, maybe it's something else. So I started, I went to physio, osteopath, chiropractor, craniosacral, acupuncturist, like all, myofascial release, all of these kind of things to see if it was something else.
Yeah.
None of those could find anything, and pretty much everything they did made it worse. Then I went to kind of, okay, maybe it's all in my head. So I went into, learning Joe Dispenza's self-healing things and going to see spiritual people and counselors and a therapist and all of these kind of things to see if it's some kind of emotional blockage, some kind of spiritual thing. That was probably very good for me on some level, but it didn't resolve the pain still. The pain was still there. And at some point it got really bad. At one point it got to where I lost so much weight I was down to maybe 125 pounds.
Okay.
I was quite emaciated. I felt cold all the time. I had severe anxiety. I couldn't sleep. I would say I was an emotional basket case. And yeah, I mean that's the main thing. So anxiety, pain, weight loss. And I had this feeling like I couldn't breathe and stuff like that all the time. They thought it was a panic attack. I don't know. Anyway, so I also saw functional medicine doctor, nutritionists, naturopaths. They provided a little bit of more help and insight. One person said, "Yeah, sounds like mold toxicity," but we did a procedure for that. That didn't really work either. Um, and so the only thing that started to make a difference for me was, and it didn't provide all the answers, but it was the first thing that helped me find the answers, was this genetic testing service. So
What did it say?
yeah, so a few different things, and you'll enjoy these, I think, as someone who's very, has a deep understanding of these things. So, number one was it said that I had a high tendency for lead toxicity. Now, obviously, a genetic service cannot tell if you have lead exposure,
No.
but it said that I was bad at detoxifying or ridding my body of lead. Some
Yeah.
people have that with different things. Some people have it with mycotoxins, some people have it with histamine, some people have oxalates, some people have it with, different heavy metals, whatever,
Hormones. Hormones.
hormones. Absolutely. Um, I have it with lead, and not any of the other heavy metals. Now, I've done hair mineral analysis before, and it never really showed up significantly there. But I decided to spring for a blood test, which, as you know, is not particularly cheap or easy to get. And I ended up doing something you're probably familiar with, a Genova Diagnostics
Yeah.
Nutraval, which includes lead as
Yeah.
well as
That's
a load of other very helpful information. And it
very
turned out
expensive test, though.
it's very expensive. And
Yeah.
this is the point. I never would have done it if I wasn't motivated by having the genetic information first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so I got my results back, and I was shocked to see that my lead was 27 point something micrograms per deciliter. As you might know, the reference range is 0 to 3. So I was over 10 times the reference range. 45 is the level at which the World Health Organization says that it's a medical emergency and you need to go to, intensive care to get chelation therapy. Anything over 5 is considered dangerous to children because it can stunt their growth and reduce their IQ and all that. So it was significantly high. I went back to our NHS doctor over here and said, could this be the cause of all my symptoms? Because, symptoms included feeling cold, anxiety, mood disturbances, and specifically digestive issues and abdominal pain, which is exactly, the worst thing that I
Right.
was suffering with. He said, yeah, it could be. And they didn't believe the test because it's some, non-NHS lab. So they redid it. And yeah, they only said it was 20 something, but it was extremely high. Of course, the first thing they looked at was lead as exposure, right? Because it's very difficult to detoxify lead, as you probably know. So, um, and I thought, well, and so they tested my wife because my wife, we've breathed the same air, bathed in and drunk the same water, used the same herbs, roughly, used the same supplements, roughly, eaten the same food, roughly, eaten off the same crockery, roughly, been in the same environment. It's not like I was working in any industrial capacity that, would lead to this. And we'd been together for over 10 years. No, at that time, yeah, just 10 years. And she had like one, something like that, whereas I had
Right.
27. So it was not recent exposure. Now, I'm not claiming that massive difference is just because of genetics. What I assume actually is that, and this I found this out when reading the World Health Organization report on lead. It said, lead has a half-life of about 20 years, and your body will tend to store it. I mean, everywhere because it mistakes it for calcium, but it will especially store it in the bones because that's where calcium tends to accumulate. And so my understanding is that probably I had this exposure several decades ago because really thinking back, I actually had the symptoms of it for decades: high anxiety, digestive issues, much less, but still abdominal discomfort if I ate certain foods, all of this kind of stuff. And I would say reduced thyroid function. I think that's another sign of high lead, and I'll talk about that in a second. And so what happens is with this lead is it gets stored in your bones, and then it gets released into your bloodstream, and it's like having a sustained release poison in the core of your body that's just slowly leaching into your blood and undermining your health. And this is something I've probably been suffering with for a long time and didn't know. And I had been, as I said, like having a diet that anyone else would think is healthier than 98% of people for over a decade. No
Yeah.
drinking, no drugs, no junk food, no this, no that, all of this stuff. And yet I was suffering with this poison and toxicity. So that's one. I can give a few more.
So in terms of the lead and your
Mhm.
genetics, what exactly did you find out as it relates to genetics with the lead?
That my body's ability to detoxify, remove lead was impaired compared to average.
What was the SNP? Could you
I would
relate
have
to
to
that?
look it up. I
Oh,
don't
okay.
have it
Okay. It's
memorized.
interesting
Um,
because, well, just to your point, so, I want to make it clear this podcast isn't medical advice, but it's a discussion on genetics. So genetics, it's something that is almost like a potential roadmap, right?
mhm,
Like it doesn't mean like I carry certain genetic SNPs for a higher propensity for celiac disease, as an
mhm.
example. And that doesn't mean I have it or I'm for sure going to get it. It's kind of more like um, a, a possibility, right? So you
Correct.
obviously had the exposure of the lead, and then
And you'd have to have that
because,
exposure. Just the
right,
gene on its own wouldn't create high lead.
right.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of like, okay, well, I would have to put myself into a state where I am weakened for me to actually get celiac. So it's a possibility. So I want to actually
Yes.
clarify that because your genetics do not dictate your, you know, whether or not you're going to get it. Like it's your lifestyle and exposure and all of those other things that come to play that it's almost like it flips it on. Would you agree
Yeah,
with that?
absolutely. They don't dictate, but they do influence. And
Influence.
sometimes, yeah, and sometimes our reports, we actually will give you a percentage. Like I'm just looking at the lead report here. I have pulled it up. We clarify with this one, about 40% of differences in lead levels may be attributed to genetic factors. So it's less than 50%, but it's still significant. It's still
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
Just to answer your question, there wasn't one specific SNP or gene which it's isolated. In this case, it was 14 genetic variants, so it wasn't a huge amount. I could list some of them for you, but I don't know if that'd be interesting.
No, that's okay. I'd like to get into terminology explanation
Yes.
because I think that people would really benefit to understand because I'll be like, oh yeah, I carry a SNP for this or a SNP for that. And then I'll be like, okay, SNP is single nucleotide polymorphisms, right? And so for
Mm.
immediately you'll get people, it'll be like, whoop, right? Over their heads. And then there's alleles, and then there's homozygous versus heterozygous. Then there's genotype. So let's kind of give very short because I want it to be consumable, understandable. What is a SNP?
It is well, the simplest explanation, it's a variation in your genes or a mutation in your genes that makes you different from someone else.
Right. And so
The
some
the
SNPs
sl
might be more common, like in more people, whereas others might be more rare. Would that make sense?
Absolutely. And, a common example is your eye color or your hair color. The reason that you have one and that someone else has another will be down to a series of SNPs. They will
Okay.
be what determines that. And I think that visual cue helps people like easily grasp it.
Yes. Now, what about alleles?
So the
So,
definition of allele is actually similar. So usually I start with allele first. So allele is actually a variation between one gene and another that could comprise and usually does comprise of numerous different SNPs. That's my understanding of it. So you just said single nucleotide polymorphism. So of course the first word, the only word you probably have to understand out of that is the word single. So meaning one. So your genetic code, if you think about computer code, have you ever seen that? Like the movie The Matrix or something like
yeah,
that? I'm
yeah,
thinking
yeah.
people listening, it's a bunch of different ones and zeros, right? So the code that makes up you and me is similar, but instead of ones and zeros, it's a bunch of A, C, T, H, or A, G, T, H, depending, but complications we won't need to get into. So let's just say A, C, T, H. So it's different. So it might be A, T, C, A, T, H, C, A, like something like that. So if in a certain portion of my genetic code it says A, C, A, and then that same portion of the genetic code yours says A, T, A, that means that one of us has a SNP because there is a single variation between um, between those two codes. There is one
Okay.
letter that is different, and that's all that it means.
Okay. Okay. And then there's homozygous versus heterozygous. This one is the one that I actually was really researching as it related to CompT, which we are going to talk about CompT. Like I'm a
Hmm.
CompT GG.
Hmm.
So it's those, so GG simply means I have the same copy from each parent, right? If it's
Yes.
GG, that
Yeah.
means I am, so it is that homozygous? I always get it mixed up.
Yes. Yes. That's
Yeah.
homo. Yes.
Yeah. So hetero would mean if I was like AG, that means I got an
Exactly.
A from one parent and a G from the other. Is that right?
That's
Did I get
100%
it? Did
exactly
I get
right.
it right? Because
It's as simple
you
as
know
that.
what? Because it does get so confusing, but it matters because it matters in terms of the expression. Does that make sense? Please help me here.
Yes. Yeah,
Because
yeah, it absolutely does. So
I,
uh, we could focus on comps for a second if you like. It is one of my favorite ones to talk about.
well, let's first do the finish this.
Sure.
We talked about genotype. Like, what
hmm
about genotype? What does that actual word mean, genotype?
So usually I like to explain genotype in comparison to phenotype. So genotype basically just means the totality of all of that genetic code, whereas
Okay.
phenotype means how that expresses. So the fact that I'm male, the fact that I have green eyes, the fact that I have brown hair, the fact that I am the height I am, the fact that one of my enzymes works well, the fact that another one doesn't, all of that stuff in total is the phenotype. It's how that genotype expresses. So that's my understanding. So genotype is basically just who you are as a list of genetic code, as opposed to who you are as a living human being, which is more the phenotype.
Okay. Okay. I think I got it now. Because for me, even though like I'm not a genetics expert, but I've dived pretty deep into genetics to try and understand mine and my family's and analyze it. So I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's a
it's
very
just,
wise thing to do.
I think it is because, again, you're going to probably laugh at me, Elwin. I don't know if you have kids. Do you have kids?
No.
No. Okay. So I have like my
But if I did,
kids.
I would be even more interested in genetics,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
So I have my kids, my husband, and I go through and they're away at university. I'm like, okay, you can't do this. You better take this because you have this genetic predisposition for this. And we want to try and avoid it, considering what a crappy lifestyle you're living right now as a university student. Right.
hmm
So
Yeah.
I think a lot of things, and this isn't to scare other parents out there or anybody about this. I think um sometimes knowing people get really afraid and they're like, "Oh my god." Like I'm like, "No, there's nothing to worry about just because you carry this. But here are some things that you can do so that you don't flip that not so great expression on."
hmm Yes. And I think a key part of that is kind of philosophical, if I may speak on that for a second. So I
Yeah.
think most people are on one or the other end of the philosophical spectrum, and I was definitely on one extreme end, which is either they believe, and I think both of these extreme ends are not really keen on any of the stuff we're talking about. That's why I want to address it. So one end believes in fate, and they believe it is the way it is, and they're like, my mother had this disease, my grandmother had this disease, I'm probably going to get it too. That's just the way it is, and I'd rather not think about it, so I don't want to hear about this. Then the other side is like, I'm the captain of my own destiny. I create my own reality. They're very attracted to, philosophies like Tony Robbins, or, self-improvement, kind of spiritual stuff, maybe. Or if they are learning about genetics, they might like the work of someone like Bruce Lipton, who says that almost all of it is epigenetics and it's almost
Yeah.
all down to your environment and your lifestyle as
Yes.
opposed to what you're born with. Um, and so both of those extremes I can understand. I would say in my early life I was very much a fatalist, and then kind of when I shifted in my late 20s, as I described earlier in my story, I kind of shifted to being like, no, I create my own reality, I shape my own destiny. It doesn't matter, like what has happened before, and so I understand the appeal of both philosophies. But what I would recommend to people is that actually the truth is somewhere in between. So there's a bunch of stuff that you've
I'm with
been
you.
given that you can't do much about, in terms of it's there as a factor, but you actually can make a difference as well. So it's basically both. And I had an interviewer ask me a couple of days ago, like, how much of your life is genetics? And it was such an open-ended question, but I just gave an answer. I said, it's about 40%. And that's, I mean, that's obviously a guess, it's an estimate, but it's based on looking through so many of these reports and seeing, and your risk of having anxiety, maybe 40% determined by genetics. Your risk of having cardiovascular issues, maybe 60% determined. Your risk of having this might be 20%. And it's usually about between 20 and 75%. That's what we see on the reports. And even
Mhm.
personality, we have the personality report where we talk about the big five. Are you agreeable, disagreeable? Are you extroverted, introverted, and all that kind of stuff? And that's surprisingly accurate as well, even though it's about 50% again. So 50% of your personality was already there when you were born, and 50% of it is shaped based on your environment and your life experiences and your upbringing and all the rest of it. As I'm sure you have listened to a lot of psychology stuff, and I was amused. One of my teachers said, before I had my own children, I believed that everything was 100% down to environment and how you bring up your children. And then as soon as I had children, I believed it was 100% down to genetics, and that kids are just born that way, right? Because they do seem to come out with certain kind of personalities,
Yeah.
almost independent of how you raise them, right? To some
Yeah.
degree, but only to some degree, right? So that's the thing. And as much as that's true for your kids' personalities, that one is just feisty and one is just more thoughtful, or whatever it might be, that's true for all the other stuff as well, like how well this enzyme functions and how well your digestion functions and whether you have a tendency towards inflammation in your arteries and all of this stuff. There's a certain
Yes,
percentage that is inbuilt, and then there's a certain percentage that is based on what you do during your life.
I agree. And then, just knowing is so I'll give you an example. My husband's father and his father all died very young, late 50s, of heart disease.
Mm.
And so what do I do? So I am certified in functional lab testing as well for nutritionists. So I analyze not only his genetics, right? I look at his
Mm-hmm.
genetics and what I have access to, but I also look at actually lifestyle, blood work. I mean, I'm a sheer joy to live with, let me tell you, Elwin. Can you
Yeah,
imagine? Um,
I'm that person in my household. Yeah,
yes, yeah, I
I...
have to, I mean, there are certain things I just have to shut my mouth, let me tell you. But I feel it can provide you with as many really useful life tools, even in terms of what supplements will help redirect certain potential pathways.
hmm
And, I think it's a very positive thing. You just have to find the right person to work with. I think people just need to find somebody who understands all of this, and it's not going to be your general physician, people. I'm just going to
No,
tell you that right now. But you can find
rarely.
people who, yeah, you can find people who really understand genetics and then also understand diet, lifestyle, and therapeutic grade supplementation and understand blood work. Hey, I mean, he's the luckiest man in the world as far as I'm concerned.
Mm.
Anyway, let's go, let's go
Yeah,
on.
may I address your point that you just said there about testing? Because I think this is really worth emphasizing and clarifying.
Yes. Okay.
Occasionally, I tell stories because they're true of people who get their genetic test results, they take some action, and they feel better. And it does happen. But the
Yes.
stories that I prefer to tell, that I tell more often, are when people get genetic test results. And that's the test I just did for the story I just told for myself, right? I didn't say, I have a genetic tendency for this, and so I started making all these changes. I said, I have this genetic tendency for this, so I did a blood test to
Yes.
confirm. And
Yes.
that
Yes.
is, and sometimes it's urine test, sometimes it's saliva test, sometimes it's stool test, whatever. But I'm a big believer in actually testing. The only exceptions to that are certain nutrients where you have an increased need and where taking significantly more than the normal amount is completely harmless. So that would be some of the B vitamins, for instance, maybe
Yes.
magnesium. There's a few things like that. But if a genetic test said you have an elevated need for, say, vitamin A or vitamin D3, even in those cases, I'd say I would test that first, or iron, copper. I wouldn't just take extra of these things just because your genetics say so. I would actually check to make sure, because it's easy also to get too much of that. And that's definitely true of toxins. I wouldn't start some kind of detoxification regime based on only what we say. That's definitely true of hormones. I wouldn't start adding any kind of hormone therapy just based on what we say. But the value of it is, to go back to what you said there, Sandy. Um, as you said, you're a nutritionist. It's quite easy for you to order tests for yourself and for your family members and stuff. But for most people, like, you've got to pay several $100s to see a practitioner. And then if you were to test, let's say a person comes in, they're cold, they're tired, they've got digestive issues, they've got allergies, they've got chronic infections, this kind of typical pattern that you see so often of people with chronic issues who, no one seems to be able to help. It could be so many things. It could be any one of a dozen different nutrients. It could be any one of a dozen different hormones. It could be any one of, I don't know, hundreds of toxins, let's say a dozen categories of toxins. It could be any one of a dozen or so chronic infections that it commonly is, right? And you know that. And how do you narrow it down? Well, maybe you don't. You test for everything. But testing for everything, as you know, costs thousands of dollars, right?
Yes.
If you were to test for, you mentioned the Nutrival, and I'd say that's good value for money in terms of how many markers it gives you for the dollars. But there's still plenty of other tests that you would want to take if you want to get a really broad look at everything it could be. It would include all the stuff I just said. And so what I like about the genetics, so just a story. One of my business partners, he's happy for me to talk about this. He's talked about it in his own podcast. He said to me, God, I'm just feeling so tired. Every day I wake up and my alarm goes off and I have to go to work and look after the kids. And I just can't drag myself out of bed. He said, I wonder if I'm depressed. What am I low testosterone? And I said, you know what? There was more information there. I'm just kind of simplifying. I said, it sounds to me like low thyroid function, honestly. I know that's something that you're, very much into as well. I think low thyroid is very much
So common.
underdiagnosed, and way more common than people realize. But anyway, just because I think that, I didn't want to imprint that on him. And he's the kind of guy who will not go to a doctor unless he absolutely has to. He's also extremely busy. He's working 12-hour days. He's got 4 kids, which he has a very active part of their lives. Getting him to go to a doctor is not an easy thing. So just me saying, I think it's thyroid, you should go to a doctor, that was not enough. But luckily, we had his genetic results, and the genetic test is easy to do, right? You just spit into a saliva thing. You don't have to go to a doctor. You don't have to get your blood drawn, which a lot of people have resistance to. And so we looked at it and we put up his underactive thyroid report. And he had not just a high risk for underactive thyroid, but sometimes we're able to give a percentage risk score. And with underactive thyroid can. And he was in the 99th percentile, which means that in a room of 100 people, he would be the most likely to have hypothyroidism just based on his genetics. And so that was enough to convince him, okay, I need to go to a doctor in case this is it. And he did. And he did. And it turned out actually he had Hashimoto's, which,
Oh,
is
yes.
not
Autoimmune.
just an issue of a lack of thyroid, but if it's undiagnosed and untreated, then over time your immune system will destroy your own thyroid and you're left without a functioning thyroid, which is even more serious. So, that's just an example. So again, it's not a story about, hey, someone got their genetic test results and they did a simple thing and everything was okay. Like the person did have to go to a doctor, they had to get it checked, and they had to get, a prescription of a few different things, some thyroid,
Yes.
some
Yes.
LDN to deal with the autoimmune, and, some nutrition. But like it's just so much cheaper and it's so much simpler to start with genetics. And that's why I usually recommend to people to start there, unless it is particularly obvious that it's some kind of hormone or something. And then sometimes I say, look, just go straight to a doctor. But usually the genetics are a good starting place to me.
Okay, Elwin, just
Hmm.
as you were talking about thyroid, I wanted to pull up mine
Hmm.
because, as you know, I don't have a thyroid due to thyroid cancer
Hmm.
many years ago. But I pulled it up, and this is really interesting because so I had a lot of issues after the birth of my second child. I
Hmm.
had issues with adrenal function. I was exhausted. This is not an uncommon story for a new mom who had a
Very common.
toddler and a newborn, right?
Hmm. Yep.
It doesn't mean that every new mom is going to have postpartum thyroiditis.
Of
That's
course.
not what I'm saying. But
Hmm.
now in hindsight, I can go back and go, "Yep, I had that for sure." And when I look at my genetic insights, overactive thyroid and underactive thyroid, both more likely in my
Hmm.
situation. Isn't that interesting? So,
Hmm.
and for me, I went through many years of weight loss, weight gain, weight loss, weight gain, weight, right? Like I was like a yo-yo after
Hmm.
I had my second child. And so this is where a report like this could have been useful going, you know what, doc? I need you to check my thyroid because my thyroid, we won't get it. This isn't a discussion on thyroid, but TSH alone is never enough to check thyroid health.
It's
You get
useless. All it
it,
checks is pituitary function. It doesn't even check
it,
thyroid
it yeah,
function.
it doesn't even check what's actually going on with your thyroid. But there's
Hmm.
a really good example of showing how, had I known a little bit about my genetics back then, which I knew nothing about, um, that was so long ago that could have potentially helped me just help the doctor direct and like something's not right. And I know I have a higher propensity for thyroid disease. Can you please check that? So let's move
Yes.
on. Let's move on. Let's get into, because I
Hmm.
did talk about five five areas. So things that are really important. We want to know, how do we detox? What's going on with our hormones? So, like, I know myself, Elwin, I have a weakness with hormones in general.
Hmm.
Okay. And that can relate back to detox, right?
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
back when I was very young, I had issues with estrogen detoxification for sure. Doctors back then put me on the pill because of it. You see what I'm saying? So,
Hmm.
knowing this information for your family could be just so important. So, detox, hormones, inflammation. We know inflammation is usually at the root of most diseases,
Hmm.
metabolism, and weight and glucose. So, but then you hear some of these experts in the wellness field who will only talk about certain genes. So,
Hmm.
how does somebody piece it together? So let's start with detox. Are there some specific SNPs people need to take a look at and analyze as it relates to their own ability to detox?
So they can do. We were talking about this a little bit beforehand.
Yeah.
So there are different services out there, and I don't want to be negative about anyone. I just want to explain the difference. So a lot of services out there, what they're doing is they're taking your raw data. Sometimes they're testing. Sometimes you can just upload your test results from somewhere else, just like with us, like Ancestry or whatever. Um, but they're basically looking at one specific line of your genetics and
Which is the
going,
SNP, right?
which is a SNP, exactly, and going, based on that, there's this tendency. Now, the problem with that is it's not that it's inaccurate, but it's just so incomplete, it can
Yes.
easily be misleading. So, there are things talked about like MTHFR is probably the most famous one, MTR, GPX, the glutathione one,
Then there's the
SO,
BRCA gene, right?
yeah, yeah, all of those kind of ones. So I'll give you a contrast. Like for detoxification in our system, um, first of all, we have a detox report, and I'm just pulling it up now to check it. But in that report, we're going to be evaluating. And I'm just checking to make sure because I didn't check this beforehand. But I think we're evaluating over 1 million SNPs.
A
So
million.
I'm pretty sure. I'm just going to confirm it. If
Wow.
it's not 1 million, it's hundreds of thousands. And so the point is that rather than, oh yeah, here it is. Okay. Rather than saying, okay, here's one SNP and this is what it means, and like globalizing from that, we're looking at a lot of them and coming to an aggregate view, if that makes sense. Um, so for instance, if I'm trying to think of an analogy. Um, so okay, so this particular report. Oh no, you know what? I was thinking of the cardiovascular one. Sorry, I was looking at that one just before this. The
Okay.
cardiovascular report that we do is, I think, 1.3 million. The detox one is way less. Sorry, it's only 44 SNPs, but it's still 44 SNPs. So we're looking at, the different SIP ones, SIP A1A1, the bunch of them. We're looking at the GSTP, which is the glutathione ones. We're looking at the UGT ones, which are also related to glutathione. We're looking at the NAT ones, which are related to acetylation, which is another type of detoxification. We're looking at the SOD, which is
Oh,
superoxide
SOD.
dismutase.
That's a big one that is looked at. So let's,
Yes.
instead of naming this, so what I'm going to say for anybody who's listening to this podcast is, when you are looking at a genetics service, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I'm going to just say service. I'm not sure if that's the right terminology. Make
Hmm.
sure that they are not analyzing one SNP
Or a handful. Yeah.
or only a small handful. So I'll give you like what Alwyn is saying. He's naming a bunch. There's a bunch. So
Yeah,
If
and
I
that's for
look,
detox. Just you know, our company we evaluate 83 million genetic variants out, and so those are combinations out of the 500,000 that are commonly tested among services like 23andMe and all the rest of it. So in total, for all of our different reports, we have over 500 reports. A lot of companies out there, they're testing 4, 6, 10,
yes,
50, maybe
yeah,
something like that, uh, and so because of that, we do it differently. So for their reports, they have to kind of teach you about genetics because they have to go, you have this gene called MTHFR, and you have this SNP called this, and you have the GG version. And so that means that you need more folate or you need more vitamin
yes,
B2 or whatever it might
yes,
be. So you almost have to have a biochemistry lesson to even understand your results, or you need a practitioner to go through it with you and kind of do it like you know we work with a medical doctor in the UK, and you know when I showed her our system, she's like, well, this is fantastic because I used to have to write reports to explain what these different things, what these different SNPs meant for the client. Now you do it for us. So I mean, in essence, that's what it is. Like we, not to really take the place of your doctor, but to make it a lot easier for your doctor so they don't have to go through and like, you know, try and work out what it means, because otherwise there's contradicting information, right? You're like, oh, your SOD enzyme is working fast. So enzymes, by the way, we should define what that means.
yeah,
An enzyme is a little chemical factory in essence that turns one thing into another thing. So it's in the business of transforming something into something else. That's the simplest way that I like to look at it. And so genes control enzymes. And so variants in those genes, back to the SNPs things, will affect the functioning of those enzymes. And it can get pretty complicated, but just the simple way I like to look at it, and that's often the way that it's taught as well, is just basically sometimes it makes the enzyme go slower and sometimes
yes,
it makes the enzyme go quicker. And so if you have a gene that, you know, quickly turns something toxic into something less toxic, then they go, oh, you're good at detoxifying. But then you might have another gene that is the opposite. You know, they're like, oh, you're bad at detoxifying. And so rather than having these contradictory results, like what our service actually does, and you know, we're our parent company, they have several dozen full-time scientists, several dozen full-time AI engineers. And so what those people are doing all the time, the scientists are constantly pulling research and updating research. And then the AI engineers are like building this incredibly complex machine that evaluates all of these different data points based on the research and says, okay, based on all of that, your ability to detox is ultimately good. And I was shocked, actually. I thought it was so inaccurate. When I got my detox report back, it said, overall, your ability to detox is good. And I'm like, but my lead is so high. Like, how is that possible? You
yeah,
know?
yeah,
But
yeah.
then when I actually look at it, and, you know, my homocysteine is always very low, and
So is mine.
all the markers, you know, like the HSCRP is always the lowest, and the 8OH, DG, you know, and all the kind of detox markers, the pyroglutamate, all of that stuff is always like an optimal level. And so I realized it's not that I'm bad at detoxifying in general, it's just that I'm bad at detoxifying certain things specifically. Right. And so I don't need to dedicate my whole time to detox. And I used to do so much detoxing. It turned out actually my problem was I had a really slow metabolism. I was malnourished. And the last thing that I should have been doing was loads of fasting, loads of,
Right.
and every time you take something that speeds up detoxification, if your detoxification is already fast, all I was doing is accelerating the rate at which the lead was being pulled from my bones into my bloodstream, making me feel worse. So detoxing in general was a completely unhelpful strategy for me. And I never would have known that if I hadn't seen, as I said, not just analyzing these. Oh, just because if I just look at my MTHFR and if I just look at my GPX and a couple of others, I think like all of them using someone else's service, obviously I won't name them, it kind of made it seem like all of my detox channels were not working very well. But then when I got, you know, looked at our service that actually looks at all of the relevant factors and said, overall, you're doing great. Like your genetic capacity is great. And as I said, my actual test results, like my organic acids and my blood tests and all the rest, reflected that overall I'm doing great, even though I specifically have very high levels of lead.
So all of this genetic stuff boils down to confidence in the information that you're getting.
Yes.
That is how I feel. because if
Hmm.
I'm reading a report that's going to show me a propensity for something, and then I go and I want to match to have a lifestyle to avoid it, well, like, I want to be confident in the information that I'm getting.
Hmm.
Because so I pulled up the actual report about underactive thyroid, and this is really interesting, Elwin,
Hmm.
because I haven't found this. Listen, we were talking, I'm a little bit of a genetics geek. I
Hmm.
love it. I have done at least 10 different services, tests, whatever. Nobody's ever given me this information.
Interesting.
Okay, I have learned about the Fox, I forget, one Fox gene that may give me a higher propensity for thyroid cancer.
Hmm.
But this information about underactive thyroid is so interesting because based on 875 genetic variants that they looked at, that your database looked at, I am in the 82% percentile
Hmm.
for hypothyroidism. And then I go down and I see all these SNPs that provide me with that information to conclude I'm in the 82nd percentile.
Hmm.
So, this is what I want everybody to be able to capture from this interview is that not all genetic tests are created equal. And some may say the exact opposite. And I want to give an example here. I have done a test that said I have absolutely no issues with glucose metabolism or
Hmm.
insulin resistance. I have none. That none of my genetics, they actually said great, great ability. Well, guess what? In 2022, I was 52. I was starting to experience some symptoms of menopause. My HbA1c rose to 6.1, which is insulin resistant,
Yep.
prediabetes. And I was like, what the hell? Like, I haven't done anything different. The only thing I'm doing is my body is my ovaries are starting to shut down. So, what the heck? Why is this happening? I'm a nutritionist. This shouldn't happen. The
Hmm.
report that I saw said I shouldn't have any issues with that. Yet something flipped that switch. When I looked at your reports, it showed that I have a propensity for this. So, had I known this, listen, I always eat clean, but it's more about changing how I eat. I became a certified metabolic balance coach at that time because I'm like, I need it. Like, I need to learn this.
Hmm.
And there was something going on with my metabolism. And so I changed how I ate, and now my HbA1c is a 5. So, there's
Wow.
where and that's 0 drugs, 0
Mm.
pharmaceuticals. That is me doing it all through diet, lifestyle, and, I do take glucose stabilizers. So, had I known this, that this is a potential, we all know a lot of women around menopause start to experience odd symptoms. This is perimenopause, menopause, because
Mhm.
there are major shifts going on in our bodies around that time. So I want to note that you can get really, really different information depending on which service you use.
100%. I won't name any names, but I remember using a service and like just being shocked at how inaccurate the information was. And this wasn't even one of those types that just evaluates a snippet at a time. They claimed that they were crunching the numbers and, coming to a conclusion. And so yeah, going back to what you said there, Sandy, unfortunately, I mean, you can choose to trust me, and that would be great, obviously. But unfortunately, the only real way you can actually be sure, as you said, is to try a bunch and see which ones are actually accurate. And
And then
I,
match your lifestyle and your blood work to it, right?
yes, yes,
And then you
and
could
confirm the
say,
accuracy with other tests. Absolutely. Yeah.
yes. So I can confidently say that that one test that I did was totally inaccurate. Totally.
Yes. And just to explain that, like there may be something that you have that our reports also say that you don't have a genetic propensity for. And so in that case, does that mean that we were inaccurate? I mean, maybe, but the other thing is, of course, you can sometimes have an issue that there is not a genetic predisposition for. So for instance, let's say that our tests also said that you don't have a tendency towards insulin resistance or high blood sugar, and so did everyone else's, but you still have it. Well, in that case, it would be more likely based on lifestyle factors, right? I'm not saying this is true for
Exactly.
you, but maybe you never exercise, maybe you're, gorging on high fructose corn syrup, whatever it might be. So it's not like if you don't have a genetic risk for it, that it can't be a problem for you, but it's more, I think it's actually really helpful. So an example of this that I like to use is allergies and intolerances. So I used to have all these foods I reacted to. I think I said that. I think at one point I could count on one hand the foods that I didn't have some kind of reaction to. And so I always assumed that I had a bunch of different food allergies and intolerances, and that there's nothing I could do about it because it's just genetic. I
Mhm.
also, as I said, I've been underweight all my life, and I always assumed there's nothing I could do about that, and that's just genetic because my dad was always very thin, whereas my mother was overweight. I thought, well, I take after my dad. There we go.
Yeah.
As it turns out, when I looked at my genetic reports, it seemed like the results were wrong because it said that I had a tendency to be average weight, not underweight. And it said that I had a tendency for the only food intolerances that I had a genetic tendency for was gluten. And so, again, that was wrong because there were all kinds of other things I reacted to. But
Yeah.
then I discovered what was actually going on is that I had SIBO. And that as a result, I had malabsorption. And so once I started to correct that, I was able to put on weight and I was able to become not overweight or underweight, exactly as my genetic report said. And I was able to start eating all those foods again, exactly as my genetic report says. So the good thing, for instance, if you have a bunch of foods that you react to and it says that there is not a genetic basis for it, that's good news because it means if you fix whatever problem is going on in your digestive tract, you should be able to eat those foods again. Whereas if there is a genetic basis for you not being able to eat those foods, then it's more bad luck. You're probably, even though you could reduce your reaction to those foods, you'll probably never be 100% good with them because there is genetic basis for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So we kind of talked about hormones. We didn't really like I'm kind of changing the direction of this recording, I'm realizing, because it's more about understanding that the conversation should not really rely upon one snip.
Hmm.
And it should really rely upon data that you can kind of compile all together to come up with your own little personal roadmap on how you can live a healthier life to try and avoid some of the potential issues that could come down the road. So, we can talk a little bit more about inflammation and metabolism because people care a lot. We did talk about glucose issues.
Hmm.
So the one test I did said I have none. The other test that I did with you said I have potential issues. And we
Hmm.
know in like real life I did have issues.
Yeah, because you were
So
eating a diet healthier than most people and you still developed
I
the high
still developed the
A1C.
issues. It was
Yeah.
more that I had to learn how to eat differently than I'm going to do quote unquote a normal person would eat, um, in order to avoid this issue becoming a bigger problem for me, like type 2 diabetes.
Hmm.
So, I mean, metabolism is huge. And I don't know, Elwin. I don't know how much of it is genetic and how much of it is lifestyle. Because you do see a lot of obese children from obese
Hmm.
parents, right? Like, it's kinda common.
Yes.
You can see that. I have never been obese, but I have definitely been overweight since I've had my thyroid removed. I'm not gonna lie, it's been a bit of a struggle of me trying to maintain my weight, and that's for how many years? That was in 2011, now we're in 2024, so 13 years, right? 13 years?
Mm.
Of
Yeah.
me trying different things to maintain weight. So that to me right there is the fact that I don't have a thyroid anymore. So you kind of have to gather all the pieces of the puzzle. Both my parents, 87 and 78, almost 87. My dad's birthday's next week. Um, Never had issues with weight, never had issues with thyroid. But then there's me here.
Hmm.
So, you know, did I turn on that gene? Did I flip that on because of my lifestyle of no sleep, new mom, nutrient deficiencies, a lot of things going on, adrenal dysfunction? These are questions that everybody needs to ask themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, metabolism and weight are very interconnected. I'm very impressed that you immediately talk about thyroid, although of course I understand it because so many people talk about metabolism and they talk about food, they talk about sugar, they talk about all kinds of nutrients, and they don't talk about thyroid. But the
Yeah.
the primary thing that controls the rate of metabolism is the thyroid. So,
Yes.
we do have a metabolic rate report. We have a metabolic syndrome report, so we have things that reflect all these. But when I hear someone who struggles to lose weight, those actually aren't the first reports I look at. The first report I look at is to go look at the hormones, and I look to see, first of all, what's going on with the thyroid. Second of all, I look at cortisol. Third of all, actually look at oxytocin, which is not commonly thought of, but I think is very important when it comes to this. Um, and so, yeah, I don't. And to me, a lot of the people make fun of people who say, "Oh, I can't lose weight because of my thyroid," and I hate that because I feel the fact is, if your thyroid is fast enough, which is often, or too fast, which is referred to as hyperthyroidism, it is literally impossible to hold on to weight no matter how much you eat,
No matter
right?
what.
So if that's true, it's not a binary. It's not as if it's not like it goes click, click. You're either thyroid's fine, click it's under, click it's over. It's actually a scale. And so, of course, if your metabolism is fast and you're more towards the fast side, you do get to a point where you can pretty much eat as much as you want and you'll want to eat a lot if your metabolism is fast and you don't put on any weight. I'll give my wife as an example for this.
Yeah.
She's 5'5". She's never been overweight, but by her standards, she was. She was 70 kilo. What's that? 155 pounds. It's a bit. And she's tried Ozempic, right? So the way Ozempic works is it massively reduces your appetite,
Yeah.
kind of by poisoning you, in my opinion. But that's my opinion. But let's say certainly it massively reduces your appetite and massively slows the transit time at which food moves through your digestive tract. I think that's not a matter of opinion. Okay. So she did that for a bit. She did that for a month and a half, and she did lose some weight. She went down to 130 pounds, I think, something like that. The problem was, as soon as she stopped, and she stopped eventually because it made her feel so sick and so awful, the weight started coming back right back on again. So that's
Yes.
because the less you eat, the more your metabolism slows down. Because other than thyroid, the primary signal to your mitochondria in the core of almost every cell of your body, which is the thing that creates energy, which is the thing that metabolism ultimately is based on, is other than thyroid is the amount that you eat. So the less you eat, the more the mitochondria goes, oh, there must not be enough food. Let's go into conservation mode, slow everything down, burn less. The person feels colder. The person doesn't have enough energy for all the peripheral systems of their body, like the immune system, the digestive system, the hormonal system. Libido goes down. They're more likely to have chronic infections. You're more likely to have digestive issues. You're more likely to have dry skin. You're more likely to have constipation. You're more likely to feel cold all the time. You're more likely to feel low energy. Um, and all of that happens. So if you start eating again, once you've slowed your metabolism down, then you'll put on weight easier. I say all
Yeah.
this to say there's a happy ending to this. She also started doing thyroid optimization. She's on T3 only therapy specifically, which is a bit
Hmm.
controversial, but I'm a believer in. It's been very effective for
I
her.
write about that actually.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to having you on my podcast to talk about that.
I'm
So
on I'm on 3 different thyroid medications and 4 different doses. So it's a beautiful mix, let me tell you. But I
nice.
had to advocate pretty hard for that.
Nice. I definitely want to hear about that. But
Yeah,
yeah, just to give an example of her, now she's back down to 125 pounds. She eats
amazing.
so much, she can eat whatever she wants. She's reasonably active because she's kind of doing stuff all day, gardening around the house, whatever. But she never exercises in terms of never goes to the gym, never runs, never does anything, eats as much as she wants. and she still doesn't put on any weight. And so
Yeah.
it's as effective as Ozempic. The difference is you're not feeling sick all the time. You're not starving yourself. You're not slowing down your metabolism. In fact, as you know, when you get your thyroid right, you start to feel joyful. You start to feel, super high in energy. You start to feel, you start to love life again. I really think thyroid is the true root of joy, not dopamine and serotonin, all this other stuff that people talk about. Um, and so, yeah, talking about metabolism, I think the thyroid function is the first thing I focus on. Then I focus on cortisol because, as you know, if cortisol is too elevated, that will reduce the amount of thyroid getting into the
Yeah.
cells, which will still
Yeah.
slow down metabolism. Then I look at oxytocin because if a person has a genetic tendency for low oxytocin, what that means is they'll tend to feel like an emptiness inside themselves all the time, which is often like a root of addictive behavior as well. If you go to any of those kind of 12-step programs, they always talk about like this empty hole inside themselves. And oxytocin basically is the opposite. Oxytocin makes you feel fulfilled. It literally
Yeah.
makes you feel full. And so oxytocin, doctors actually do prescribe it off-label to people with addictive tendencies, especially with a tendency to overeat, because it makes you feel satiated. Once you have a big dose of oxytocin, you don't want to overeat. So that's another thing I look at for a root cause. Not that it's always oxytocin, but when I've seen people who have genetically low oxytocin, they can't stop themselves from overdoing something. And if they're trying to be healthy, they're probably not smoking and all this stuff. So they're probably overeating, even if it's supposedly healthy food. And then they find it impossible to lose weight. And so, yeah, I look at hormones first, usually.
That's brilliant. Oxytocin is not an area that I have traditionally looked at, but it makes all the sense in the world what you're saying because,
It's hard to
people,
test for, unfortunately. So that's one of
yeah,
those ones where you can't test it. So that's probably why. But in that case, I kind of rely on the genetic data and say just try some intranasal oxytocin or try like some oxytocin boosting strategies and see if it helps. And
yes,
it usually
like
does.
lifestyle, um, lifestyle for sure in that. Because I've heard mixed things about oxytocin boosting, um, like
It's
supplements.
not without risks, but if a person is really low in it, it's like a godsend to them. But you,
Yeah,
you definitely don't want
yeah.
to overdo it either.
Brilliant conversation on metabolism because the genetics piece is exactly that. It's just a piece of that. I mean, I think that, I don't know, like, how you see some parents who are very obese and then you see that they have obese children. I think there's something more to that component. Would you agree? I don't know what or SNPs would be involved in that. Like
It
gaining
depends. I'd have to
weight.
see their results. Like if I
Yeah.
do see, let's say, we have an overweight report. If I
Yeah.
see that a person is say in this top 20%, like you saw with your thyroid one, then I'd say, yeah, okay, there is a significant genetic component to
There,
it.
yeah.
But still doesn't mean that they have to live with it. And of course, it can't be only that in our society in general, because the weight has, ballooned, especially since the 80s. So obviously
Yeah.
there's more to it than just genetics. There's different
It
theories, right, about what
Yeah,
causes
but
it.
that exactly. Like, so even though I have such a higher propensity, I didn't pull up my glucose, but I know it was higher. I figured out a way to hack it,
Yeah.
right? So even though it started to creep up, and this is where, acting sooner than later is a really good idea too, because waiting until you get a diagnosis, it's always going to be harder to reverse. So, okay,
My grandmother used to say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
there you go. It's true,
Very
but
true.
very, very true. So okay. So I think we kind of answered the question about COMT, MTHFR, MTRR, MTR, ApoE does not mean you're going to have Alzheimer's for sure. ApoE4, which one is it? ApoE4, I think is the one. I think
I'd have to look it up.
ApoE4.
I haven't memorized them all, unfortunately.
Come on. You
Yeah, I
haven't
know.
memorized every SNP?
And that's
Okay.
because I am looking more holistically, just like our service does.
Yes.
Because we're
Yes.
looking at millions of SNPs. Yeah, unfortunately. I'll get there. I
Okay.
will get there.
So the thing is, and I will say the name of this, everybody knows 23andMe. Everybody knows
Hmm.
it. When you look at 23andMe, they do have a service now. Like, I think you can buy like a 1-year service for health reports.
Mhm.
I actually, so I like 23andMe just to get the raw data. Is their raw data reliable?
As far as I know, I've got to be careful not to say anything, that
Of
would get me
course.
in trouble. The thing that I feel confident in saying is that I no longer recommend 23andMe purely because a few months ago I had someone reach out to me and said that they were blocking them from accessing their raw data, and this
Yes. Yes.
this went
Yes,
on.
yes, yes, but you can email them. I had the exact same thing and I couldn't find where my raw data was on my computer. I changed my computer and so I emailed them and I had to provide some detailed information for privacy and then they gave me access. So you
Yes.
can now, but I think what happened is there was some sort of a little breach that
Yeah.
happened of privacy information. And so now they've just made it a little more difficult to get, but you can get it now. So I did it.
Yes, I mean, I used to recommend it as a default because that's the one I did back in
Yeah.
2013. These days, I recommend Ancestry. 23andMe's stock price, I think, has crashed 98%. That means that the company's in full panic mode. My opinion, and it's pure speculation, I have no insider knowledge, is that they are probably not at the top of their game right now. And I don't think that's hard to say if your stock price crashes 98% or something like that. So I just these days I recommend ancestry.com. Of course, you can get your raw genetic data from us, but I've said many times people are the only value of getting it from us is the convenience of the fact that it'll automatically be added to your
And it's
portal.
all
But
in one. You don't have
yeah,
to go and upload it. But so
but for anyone who's skeptical, I actually say by all means use another service and compare the information they give you to the information that we give you because it's pretty much the same cost. Because they do give you a little bit of health information, right? 23andMe and Ancestry is
yeah.
very limited compared to us, but um, yeah, that was one of our first testimonials. I think we got from one of the first people we showed it to. They were like, "It's everything that I wish 23andMe had been." I was like, "That's good. Can we use that?"
So can we pretty confidently say, Alwyn, that raw data is raw data? It's how all of that raw data is interpreted that matters.
Yes, except for obviously I can't say that for sure for any company other than my own. Like again, I have no idea if they're true. They may be, short sellers trying to spark completely untrue rumors, but I've heard things about people calling some of these companies' data into question. I have no idea, as I said, if it's true. In my opinion and experience, it's not true because when I look at people's results in our platform, whether the data comes from us, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, it's always very accurate. And so,
That's what I'm asking. So
yeah,
it
so
is true. So you
I
can,
I think it is, but I'm saying I
okay,
can't be sure because it's not my company and I have no knowledge. But my clinical actual experience is that it's always, reliable from
okay,
even from every other company, the raw data. But yeah, the interpretation, as we talked about earlier, is not necessarily reliable, and that's where I'd only recommend
yes,
my own company.
yes. Okay. Just because I was really, really interested in this, I'm gonna
Hmm.
go back to oxytocin. So just so that people understand this. So I pulled up my own oxytocin
Hmm.
and it said there were 83 million genetic variants, and I am in the 15th percentile for
So
oxytocin.
so low oxytocin. It should be high, medium, or low.
And I am lower than 85% of the population, Elwin.
So that means again, if this is accurate, because of course it is always adjusted by lifestyle and all the rest, but if it's accurate, it would be harder for you than average to feel contented and fulfilled. Like
That's right, though. That's my personality. Ask
okay.
my husband.
And there is an upside to that and a downside to that. The people who have low oxytocin tend to be highly motivated. They tend to be, more ambitious. My friend who I mentioned earlier, who had the low thyroid function, he
Yeah,
has genetic tendency for low oxytocin. I think that's something related to the fact he does work 12 hours a day and, is always extremely busy trying to do stuff. But, there
totally.
is also the main downside to it is this tendency for addictive tendencies.
Totally.
And
Totally. Even with food. So
mm,
that's why I So sure, I was eating healthy, but I would be like, I was almost like never satiated,
Yes.
right?
Yep. That's classic
And
low oxytocin.
and I'm still like that. So I actually have to implement strategies for myself to ensure that I don't overeat because of that, like just never satiated. I also was a smoker.
Well,
I put
you can just go back. You can do that, but that involves discipline and willpower, which is like a drag on your energy. So this is why I love going to hormones because it's actually resolving the root issue. So rather than having to put elaborate things in place to stop yourself doing what you want to do, if you increase your oxytocin, you just won't want to overdo things anymore.
no
It's like
shit.
cutting it off at the root. And so I mean, using intranasal oxytocin is the drug version that is questionable, although personally I am a fan if a person is low to consider it. But there are other things, like for instance, there's a specific strain of L. reuteri bacteria,
Taking that
probiotic
right
bacteria.
now. I'm taking
Yeah,
that right now. L-reuteri.
fantastic. Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
I
Yes.
started taking that, that's a whole other discussion,
Yeah.
but I did start taking that because here's what's interesting, Elwin. I did so much research on probiotics,
Hmm.
and a lot of the probiotics that we take are so transient. They're
Yep.
just kinda they're in there for a little while and then they're out. And sure, they might you would know this because SIBO,
Hmm.
um, they might be able to hold things at bay, meaning not allowing the really bad bacteria to take over when you're
Hmm.
taking transient probiotics, but L. reuteri can actually proliferate and create a better environment, kind of like
Yes.
prebiotics do, right? So, oh,
Yes.
that's interesting. I did not know L-reuteri can help with oxytocin,
It's a
though.
specific type. It's the type Biogaia osfortis. I
Yes,
think,
that's
but
the one.
yes, that's the
Yeah.
one. Yeah, that is the one. I think it's shown to increase oxytocin by 3 to 5 times, at least in the gut. And some of that we were, as we say, it's difficult to test for it, but it seems that it will increase it in the bloodstream as well.
And then the other thing I have tried is I have tried sublingual oxytocin, but I don't know if notice anything.
Sublingual is not very potent. The
Yeah.
types that work are either subcutaneous injectable or intranasal. And even then, it's kind of dependent on dosage. And this is
Yeah.
something that, unless you are really cavalier, you should really do with a doctor's supervision. But as we talked about earlier, your general practitioner is almost certainly not going to help you with that. But if you
No.
go to a hormone optimization doctor who really understands this stuff, they should be able to provide like an intranasal at a dosage that is appropriate for you that might change your life.
Yeah, because that's definitely something I struggle with, even though and listen, thyroid function, it's like I'm always, you know, trying to find that right mix and blend just so that I can control all of that a little bit. Because to your
Mhm.
point, I feel best just mentally, physically, in all ways when I'm, I guess, closer to the lower end of normal on my TSH, which
Yes.
some would even classify as hyperthyroid. So that also might be what's also creating that nervous energy of wanting to eat more, that unsatiate. You see what I mean? Like when you're
It will
hyper,
increase appetite, yes, definitely. But still, if it's excessive in terms of it's causing any weight gain when your T3 is already high and your TSH is already low, then I would look more oxytocin in that case because, you know, that's why you
yeah,
would still have even more than you need
yeah,
in
yeah.
your case,
Oh, this
based on
has
what we've
been
talked about.